Hello and welcome to the War Elephant Podcast Editor's Pick. I have with me my semi-regular co-host Jaedon,
Hello.
and we're going to go through a couple of the things that have crossed our desks at the War Elephant in the last week and a half. First thing is, we had an article, and all of these things will, of course, be in the show notes, where you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit notifications so you don't miss any of our videos. And we also have the link to join our Discord community where we talk about a lot of these articles. And in fact, some of them came up directly there. So if you're interested in keeping up to date with very respectful, researched, and relaxed conversation, the Discord is the place to go. So the first of those articles is going to be a commentary on the LATimes, which someone who writes for the LATimes talked about. What can you do about the Trumpites next door? Speaking specifically about neighbors who voted for President Trump, who, without being asked, shoveled apparently quite a lot of snow from her driveway. And she says that was nice of them, but they're still the scum of the earth, basically. And it's not our policy at War Elephant to just share articles that we disagree with. We prefer to find an article that we at least agree somewhat with. So what we're going to have in the show notes, instead of just the article, is a commentary by a young lady named Chloe Valdery, who is an anti-racism trainer who approaches anti-racism from a truly humane perspective. So she disagrees strongly with Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, who approach anti-racism from the lens that it is a zero-sum game of one must triumph and one must fail. Chloe Valdery believes in the older civil rights paradigm that when all are recognized as human, everyone is a gainer. There's no zero-sum game about it. And since it's a tweet thread, I just wanted to read through it really quickly, and then Jaedon and I will respond to it. Chloe starts with saying, shadow work entails becoming aware of the things that you do not like about yourself and taking ownership of them instead of repressing them. It requires being honest with your full, complex self. And then she links to the story as an example. Note that the author of this LATimes article seems to despise Trump supporters due to a kind of behavior she says they exhibit, while not realizing that she, too, exhibits that behavior. She can perceive that other groups are trapped in an us versus them paradigm, but can't see that she is too when it comes to Trump supporters. Instead of doing shadow work, what we do as human beings is project our own shadows onto others. And all this creates a vicious cycle, and we end up being stuck in the us versus them paradigm. We have to get rid of our obsession with perfection. If something is imperfect, it is also redeemable. So I thought that was a really humane and intelligent take on such a vicious piece. What do you think, Jaedon?
I absolutely agree. I would have said a little bit more harsh ways about this article because the vitriol from it regarding conservatives is something that I have very little tolerance for at this point. But the only way to really solve the problems when it comes to our country is a more humane approach, as she is bringing up here. We are getting too stuck as a country in an us versus them mindset, and it isn't helping solve the problems or lower the room temperature as it is. We're not actually looking at solving the problems, but blaming another group, and that's definitely something that this article epitomizes.
I'd agree. And I think that one of the reasons that Chloe is trying to be less harsh than I would definitely agree this article deserves is that she is really interested in doing the work that will bring us back together. And I really wanted to highlight her because she's much more on the liberal side. She campaigned for Biden. She was very happy that Biden won, but she has consistently reached out to Trump supporters and refused to demonize them and attempted to understand their concerns and talk to people who don't agree with her in a respectful way. So there's a lot of people who are like, oh, there was this one, I think it's I don't remember. It was a CNN or NBC contributor, and he said, "I've reached out to Trump supporters, but they refuse to do the work to become self-aware." I'm just like, so you reached out to them by saying, "Oh, you're a pile of garbage, but I will deign to speak to you." Chloe doesn't do that to both sides. Now, she really disagrees with both the critical race theory side and the Trump side. That people need to work together and trust each other and compromise. And I think that's why she has such a conciliatory tone. And I think that really her approach of looking within ourselves to see the mistrust and the binary, the black and white judgment of others is the way that we're going to start to trust each other better. Because if we have a more mature self, we'll have a more mature relationship with others. All right, so do check out Chloe's timeline. I give her a follow, and she has my highest recommendation, even though I don't always agree, because she has a mature attitude. Our next article is probably the big one of this week, which is Time Magazine published an article called The Secret 2020 Shadow Campaign That Saved the Election. And it is... I think Jaedon and I both think that the word gaslighting is used too often. It's a buzzword, but this is textbook gaslighting. They told us that if we said anything about the fairness or raised any question about the legitimacy of the 2020 election and Joe Biden being rightful president, we were being dangerous, and we contributed to the unrest that led to the violence on January 6th. And to be clear, we do condemn the violence on January 6th. That does not mean that we think it was a fair election. Now, I think there's a difference between fraud and fair election. And I think that the Time article shows that it really wasn't a fair election. They use phrases like, we safeguarded the proper outcome of the election, as if there was only one right answer. I mean, I think, Jaedon, you would agree that the only proper outcome of an election is when the person who gets the most votes within the system that is set up wins, right?
Yep.
But what they mean by proper election is Biden winning. That is a stacked deck. That is a rigged outcome. And I think that's deeply disturbing that one of the most prominent and oldest popular news magazines in the country is openly bragging about doing this.
And I think it's most concerning, too, that they're using language like cabal of well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies. They describe it as a conspiracy to change the outcome of the election to the proper outcome, as Ian mentioned. And the framing of this is absolutely disgusting. It frames this conspiracy, as they say it is, as a positive result of corporatist measures across several monopolistic industries in an attempt to make the outcome what they want it to be. I can't believe it.
I mean, I believe it, because the kinds of things they're talking about doing are things that they've always wanted to do.
Absolutely. And I guess I should say that I don't believe that they're actually openly admitting that this is what they did and framing it in such a way. Incredible.
The arrogance and the sheer... It is staggering to me that they are willing to publish openly just weeks after they censored people. Like, if you said, I question the results of this election on Twitter, you get this massive bit of text saying, anyone who questions the result of the election is spreading misinformation. You cannot respond to, like, or retweet this tweet. Like, they made it impossible to spread this kind of thing on Twitter. And then they openly brag about doing that. Like, it's very dangerous, this kind of thing.
It really is. And honestly, I'm a little surprised they haven't memory holed this article already. It's still up as of a week later. It was published on Thursday, the 4th of February, 2021. And it's still up a week later, which is a little surprising to me, but at the same time, not so much, because they didn't publish this without knowing perfectly well what the reaction would be.
I am really curious what they think they're going to gain. I mean, when you look at this kind of thing from a political perspective, you're always looking for what's the benefit, who benefits, where's the money, where's the power flowing from this action. And this feels really counterproductive, unless they think they're so powerful that conservatives and Republicans will never be able to counter this kind of thing. And that's where I want to kind of push back on the article. I mean, this article has a triumphalist tone, like the Democrats will be in power forever. Now, of course, there are some people like Ezra Klein who think that we should make Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico states so that the Democrats will be in power forever. But I think that is simply just not going to happen. I think that the country is too evenly divided for that kind of brutal suppression of such a huge part of the population to happen. But
Sure hope so.
But I think that if you look at, there's an article from the Federalist that we're going to link, and also an article from the New York Post, both of which talk about this gaslighting that we're talking about, and also what the actual troubling things are. So it's not the case that all the conspiracy theories, like the Dominion voting software was hacked, or they filled out a bunch of fraudulent ballots. Like one person filled out bunches of them. That's not what the Time magazine is admitting, and it's not, I think, what conservatives should take from this article. And I do want to point out that a lot of the losses that would have turned the victory to Trump are so narrow that if Trump had actually gotten his game together, for example, if he'd disciplined himself in the first presidential debate, or if he had chosen to prominently market MAGA masks, taking away that weapon from the Democrats' advertising campaigns, or if he had chosen to there's one other thing. Oh, if he had chosen to really promote mail-in ballots for Trump supporters as well as for because the Democrats were really promoting mail-in ballots. So if Trump had matched them at their own game, as actually the Californian Republican Party did, which is how they actually got back some of the Congress seats that they lost so devastatingly in 2018, they actually had their own ballot collection game this time, and that really took back some of those districts. So if Trump had done that, if Trump had led the way and said, I believe in in-person voting, but if you want to vote for Trump in the mail-in ballot, vote for Trump in the mail-in ballot. If he had just changed that messaging slightly, I think that all of this machination would have failed because it was so close in so many states. So I don't want to overestimate the influence of this cabal. I think that they want themselves to have been responsible, but I think Trump is just as responsible for his own defeat as this cabal is for twisting public perception. Now, that, of course, does not absolve the cabal, but I think we do want to have that nuance. So we don't want to say this was such a broadly stolen election. It's like when in Myanmar they're having martial rule over the election unrest. What's your take on that sort of nuance that I'm spinning for the Time article, Jaedon?
I would say that a lot of the nuance is missing in politics in general. When it comes to national level politics, it's very difficult to actually understand what is rhetoric and what is reality, because a lot of what the Democrats were hitting Trump on was not really fair, I guess you could say. So when you mentioned the masks, and a lot of the COVID response was actually very strong from Trump, and Trump's rhetoric about mail-in ballots was actually pretty bad early on in May. But he came around in September or so, and he started really pushing that. The campaign was really pushing that. I would say a lot of that did have to do with the speaking of Ron Bishop, the county chairman of Fond du Lac County. A lot of our campaigning efforts in the area actually very much helped I would say strengthen our leads in the local races. We reached a record amount in Fond du Lac County, but it wasn't enough to win the state. And I think that if we did have a more unified messaging across the country, we probably could have eked out a victory, as you point out, Ian.
Yeah, and again, I'm not saying that Republicans as a whole had the wrong idea. I think that obviously the Fond du Lac GOP and, as I mentioned, the California Democrats, they really did sort of get with the times and get with where it's going to eke out some victories and to increase leads. But I think that Trump himself clearly had this idea that, you got to stick with that in-person voting, even though there's so much pressure. And unfortunately, as I mentioned before, I really am not in favor of mail ballots because I think that they're simply not set up for careful counting, careful production and collection. I do have a real hesitancy about it, but I think that if you want to win, you have to be willing to go where the votes are, because that is what an election is.
Absolutely.
You can't just be like, well, this is the way I prefer something, so I'm only going to accept votes. I'm only going to promote votes this way. You got to get every vote you can, and I really don't think Trump was doing that. And I'm blaming this on Trump. I'm not saying Republicans. I'm not saying any specific. I think Trump had bad messaging, and that's always been on him. All right, so definitely check out. I don't really like to give the Time Magazine article an article, but it is a primary source. I do want to recommend that Federalist and the NY Post article. I think both of them are really thoughtful in the way they approach it. I don't agree with either of them completely, but I do think that they provide nuance. They're conservatives responding carefully to this really triumphalist and gaslighting article by Time Magazine. Next item that I wanted to talk a little bit about is we got some Quora answers that we've shared on the space about vaccine distribution. So originally there was a bunch of pressure from the critical race theory side to push vaccination as a priority for what they call frontline workers. And the reason they push this category is because that category is disproportionately black people or people of color, probably including Hispanic people. But the dominance of the Black Lives Matter organization probably means that the black people are more important to them for optics. Whereas most scientists, and as just an intuitive thing, a virus that primarily kills people who are older than 65, the people who are older than 65 should be first in line for the vaccines. And thankfully, it looks like they're abandoning this cruel policy, a policy that's withholding vaccines from the people most at risk in order to meet a political agenda. They're looking at the results and saying this isn't working. We need to change, and I think they are changing. But I think it's horrifying that something this counterintuitive and this obviously wrong made it to the top levels of government in a pandemic. What's your take on that, Jaedon?
Yeah, the fact that it was official policy by the CDC and the official guidelines to distribute the vaccines in a way that would intentionally cause more harm than not. I would say that I can't believe it, but I can believe it because these are some crazy times we live in. But I think we actually covered this a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago.
Well, yeah, back when the vaccine was first announced, they started really agitating for this specific distribution pattern. But because we shared these answers on the War Elephant site on Quora is why I wanted to highlight it again to sort of give people an update on what that situation is.
Yeah. But I have to say that I am very glad that they're reversing that policy. And I would like to reiterate that I am both shocked and not shocked that it was official policy, but that is the way it goes, I suppose.
Yeah. And our last item that we wanted to talk about was I am a nerd, so I don't really pay attention to sports. But I know that the Super Bowl was on Sunday, and our founder, John Davis, wrote a really great article about soccer. And it touches on sports culture in the U.S., which is sort of epitomized in the Super Bowl, which I think is the most watched sports event in America. So it's kind of the Super Bowl is American sports culture. And John just talks about the difference between playing and competing at sports. And I would maybe use the term professionalization of sports. I think that's a really worthwhile read. And I think that the professionalization and competing, while it is an aspect of capitalism that I don't think is bad, I think that it also is an aspect of capitalism that we need to combine with institutions like the church, the family, local neighborhoods, communities, bowling leagues, just all these institutions that make sure that we're not atomized into bubbles of extreme competing economic interest. Instead, we're jostled together by location and local interest that force us to compromise with people who don't agree with us on anything. And I think playing sports as a community instead of competing to be part of the national professional organizations that create so much, to be fair, entertainment and fun, but it also, I think, robs us of some of the pleasures of local community and local sports. Did you ever play any sports, Jaedon?
I played hockey when I was in elementary school, and I played track and field in high school.
And what did you think about what John was talking about, playing sports versus competing?
I would definitely say there's a big part of that. Sports is more than just winning the game. It's about having fun and working together with your team if you play a team sport, and having a good time, in my opinion. I've never really been a competitive player. I've always been a good sport. I did it for the fun of it. I personally am not a fan of national sports teams and stuff like that. I'll watch them if I'm with someone at a party or something like that, but I won't actively seek it out. It's more of a social thing, and that's why I think a lot of people need to understand that it's just more for the fun of it.
Well, I will admit that I really have a competitive streak, and it's only been in the last, I would say, 6 to 8 years that I've started being able to enjoy losing, because I learn things about myself and learn how to interact with other people in a way that there's pleasure in other parts of the game. But I do think that John really offers some wisdom, and I hope that people will look at sports and all kinds of human activities in a way that we can develop more in communal ways. And of course, John is just a really great writer, so I really recommend the piece for that alone. That's kind of all we had. A little bit of a shorter episode this week, but we covered a lot of ground, some really meaty topics. I appreciate you joining me, Jaedon.
Glad to be on.
So I will see you next week. Hopefully, we'll be going to release our next episode on Sunday, but it might be later depending on scheduling. But we will come back with more Editor's Pick a War Elephant podcast. Remember to subscribe on whatever podcast platform or YouTube that you're on. Give us some likes and reviews. Follow us on Twitter. And, of course, join the Discord. All of these things will be linked in our show notes. Thanks for listening.